By the time I walked in, Caleb was already halfway through his coffee, sleeves rolled up, tapping his pen like he was in some kind of silent standoff with death itself. That was Caleb Frost. Always carried himself like he was in on a secret the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. And most of the time he was. But that morning, something felt off. He didn't look drained. He looked done. Like a guy who had finally ticked the last box on a never-ending list and was ready to walk away. I didn't say a word. You just didn't interrupt Caleb when he was buried in funding covenants. The guy was fluent in legalese across 3 asset classes, built our compliance system from scratch, and could quote the Series B burn clause like it was his favorite movie line. He didn't care for spotlight moments, never gave speeches, never sent Slack emojis, never raised a glass at product launches. But when your job hinged on not getting shredded by federal auditors, Caleb was the guy who kept your world steady. He was the anchor in a hurricane. Then came Aspen. You could hear her heels before you saw her. Tight blazer, tighter agenda, and a vibe that screamed, "I'm here to win," whether you liked it or not. First executive sync as interim CO. She strolls in like she's walking a runway, flips her platinum hair like she's selling shampoo and says, "We need to cut the dead weight." She barely glanced at Caleb, like he was just a dusty file sitting in some forgotten server folder. That was mistake number 1. Quick pause if you're already into this story and thinking, "Yep, I've met an Aspen." Go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps the team more than you think. And if you're part of the 97% who watch but don't subscribe, maybe now's a good time. We've got more stories coming that'll knock you sideways. Alright, back to Aspen. She took one look at Caleb's systems and called them overly complex. Said we had too many friction points. Never mind the fact that those friction points were the reason our last compliance audit came back clean. Not a single flag. But Aspen didn't care about that. She wanted fast, disruptive, lean innovation. She read one white paper and suddenly thought caution was a weakness, not a strength. Caleb didn't argue. He just started printing. Day after day, folders stacked up on his desk, neatly labeled in that sharp, slanted handwriting of his. Escrow rights original. Investor trigger clauses, Frost signatory. Federal oversight attachments read only. People figured he was just cleaning up old files. But I knew better. Caleb wasn't archiving. He was digging a grave. And it wasn't for himself. One afternoon during lunch, she made a joke in front of the interns. "He's acting like it's Y2K again," she said with a smirk, sipping her green juice. They laughed nervously, trying to stay on her good side. Caleb didn't say a word. Just closed his laptop and left the room like a man who knew how to exit before the flames reached the ceiling. Aspen never got it. Caleb wasn't just some decorative legacy holdover. He was part of the foundation. You don't rip out the steel beams because they don't look trendy in a PowerPoint. He was wired into everything: the investor terms, the regulatory code, the clause-by-clause skeleton that held the whole machine upright. But Aspen didn't read the details. If someone wasn't clapping in meetings, she figured they weren't pulling weight. The cracks started showing quick. A funding clause that couldn't move without his sign-off. A Q4 audit he refused to rush without full legal backing. She rolled her eyes. Called him dead weight. Told legal she was considering a reorg. And Caleb? He just slid another folder into the drawer. This folder had a simple label on it. If. When. The first time Aspen called Caleb out in front of the whole team, she didn't even bother looking up from her tablet. "Some of us are trying to move fast," she said, flicking through her slides with that fake TED Talk swagger. "But we're stuck in molasses because of legacy systems that belong in a museum." She didn't say his name, but she didn't need to. The entire room turned toward him like she'd lit a spotlight over his chair. Caleb didn't react. He just blinked once, slow and steady, like he was measuring the wind right before a hurricane comes ashore. Then he leaned back, clicked his pen, and scribbled something in the corner of a legal pad I later saw was labeled Contingency Tier C. Aspen kept going. "Why do we need 6 approval layers for a vendor contract under $100,000? Why does investor reporting take 3 weeks? And what even is a Class F compliance chain?" She said it all with the same tone you'd used to mock old antiques you found in your grandpa's garage. Nobody spoke up. Not one person. I watched 3 department heads quietly close their laptops like they were stepping back from an active crime scene. Caleb, though, he just folded his hands like a monk watching the villagers torch their own chapel. Later that night, when I headed out around 9:30, I noticed his office lights still on. He wasn't packing up angrily, and he wasn't on the phone with lawyers. He was printing everything: funding covenants, access logs, email threads tagged urgent legal escalation. When I walked past his door, he looked up and said in that calm Caleb voice, "Backing up the backbone, in case she decides to remove the spine." By the next morning, he'd already filed a process review addendum with legal, outlining every clause Aspen had violated in her restructuring emails. He didn't CC her. He didn't have to. The system did that on its own because he built the entire system. Meanwhile, Aspen strutted through the office like she'd already sold us to Elon. "We're killing bottlenecks," she announced in another meeting. "No more hand-holding. We're streamlining execution." Caleb nodded along, sipping that terrible vending machine coffee he loved for some reason. Then he quietly added a clause to our internal compliance software. If the risk liaison status changed without a board countersignature, trigger an automatic alert to Series C oversight. He didn't mention it to anyone, but I did notice he'd stopped doing sensitive work on his company laptop. Instead, he started using a plain gray ThinkPad I'd never seen before. It had one sticker on the lid. Yes, I read the terms and conditions. Classic Caleb. Aspen had no clue. She thought she was tightening her grip. Really, she was poking at a beehive with a glitter baton. Caleb wasn't shaken. He wasn't even annoyed. But he was ready. From then on, he talked less and documented more. When Aspen pushed to migrate our contract database to some flashy, unvetted platform, he simply said, "Noted," then added a timestamped entry to the system titled, "Material Deviation. No risk sign-off." That single note would turn into a nuclear warhead down the line. But at the time, it just looked like another dry audit flag. One day I finally asked him, "Why aren't you pushing back harder?" He gave me this dry, knowing smile. "Pushback implies we're in the same weight class," he said, barely looking up. Then he turned back to his screen, and I watched as he saved a backup of our entire investor protocol registry onto an encrypted thumb drive. He labeled it, "In case of Aspen." She stormed into that town hall like she was about to launch a SpaceX rocket, not take charge of a SaaS company that was barely held together by aging contracts and Caleb's encyclopedic knowledge of every clause. The lights dimmed, her curated girl boss playlist blared over the speakers, and behind her lit up a slide that read, "Velocity over bureaucracy." I counted 6 VPs in the front row nodding so hard I thought their heads might snap off. One of them actually clapped when she said, "If we're not bleeding edge, we're already obsolete." I glanced at Caleb. He was in the back, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Like a ghost no one invited but couldn't quite ignore. Then she dropped the line that told everyone exactly what was coming. "This quarter is about agile reinvention," she said, pacing like she was keynoting at Davos. "If you're not evolving, you're dead weight. We need to be willing to disrupt everything, including ourselves." Disrupt everything. A week later, Caleb got the calendar invite. Subject: Quick Sync Strategic Ops Alignment. 15 minutes. No context. No prep docs. Just a room number, Aspen as host and Clara from HR as co-host. I saw it land in his inbox. He didn't react. Just closed the email, took one last sip of his now cold coffee, and reached for that old leather folder he always kept nearby. I didn't know what I was expecting when he walked into that room. Maybe a last-ditch plea to stay. Maybe some corporate spin about shifting priorities. But it wasn't that. Aspen was already seated. Clara too. No greetings. No eye contact. Aspen had a type statement in one hand, and a laminated folder in the other like she was gunning for a role on Who Wants to Fire a Foundational Employee. She didn't even clear her throat before launching in. Effective immediately, the board has accepted our recommendation to sunset the strategic risk function as it currently exists, she read aloud, using that robotic cadence people adopt when they think quoting policy makes them sound authoritative. "We thank you for your contributions. Your final paycheck will include accrued PTO and severance as outlined in Section 3.1b. Caleb cut in flat and calm. She blinked just once. "There will be a transitional offboarding period of 2 business days unless otherwise extended in writing by legal. He finished. Then for the first time he smiled. It wasn't smug. It was the kind of smile you give when you see a train coming and you're the only one not standing on the tracks. Aspen faltered. You could practically see her trying to reroute her script, but the energy in the room had shifted. Clara looked visibly tense, probably realizing she just walked straight into a regulatory thresher. Caleb stood, smooth and deliberate, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt like time was on his side, and said a single word, "Noted." Then he reached into his folder, pulled out a manila envelope, and slid it across the table. "For your records," he said. Article 7.1. Board Review Requirement. Wet signatures only. Aspen didn't touch it. Caleb didn't press. He gave Clara a brief nod. She looked like she wanted to throw the whole envelope into a fireplace, and walked out without another word. No elevator. Just the stairs. One slow, measured step at a time. No yelling. No anger. No dramatics. Just a man walking away from a building he already knew was on fire. It was Friday morning, right on the dot, 10 a.m. Time for the monthly leadership Zoom. Usually those calls were just a dull loop of KPI updates and awkward small talk. But Aspen had warned us this one would be decisive. That word alone had half the department reaching for their therapist's numbers. Caleb logged in 2 minutes early like he always did. Same worn blue Oxford, same old cracked reading glasses he refused to replace. His mic stayed muted, camera on, sitting upright like a guy who knew he was about to become the headline of the day. Aspen, of course, was late. She popped in with her AirPods, full of smug energy, her virtual background showing off some mid-century loft that clearly wasn't her real apartment. She waited just long enough to make people think we'd get a typical agenda. Then she hit us with it. No lead-in, no setup. "Before we dive into department updates," she said, "there's one structural change I want to address directly." A few folks straightened up, sensing something was off. Then came the smile, calculated, cold. Effective immediately, we've parted ways with Caleb Frost, formerly head of strategic risk. His value has been recalculated. At 0. She dropped it like she expected applause. Like it was some kind of power move. The silence was brutal. A Slack ping went off in the background and immediately got silenced. On screen, HR's head of personnel froze like someone had just handed her a live grenade. Her eyes darted, unsure if this was a poorly timed joke or the opening line of a lawsuit. Aspen kept talking about leaner models, eliminating friction, the usual fluff, but no one was listening. Everyone was locked on Caleb's video window. Still there. Still live. He didn't say a word. Didn't flinch. Just closed his laptop mid-sentence. The screen going black with a clean snap that somehow echoed across every mic on the call. And just like that, he was gone. Aspen kept going, voice a little tighter now. She jumped into onboarding schedules and team reshuffles, sliding names around like puzzle pieces no one else could see. "We'll be accelerating KPI timelines," she announced. "Expect draft workflows by Monday." Like she hadn't just ripped the company's spine out and tossed it in the shredder. What HR failed to do, what they somehow overlooked, was route the termination through legal. There was no board sign-off, no signature verification through the compliance tracker Caleb himself had built. They skipped the checklist, skipped the guardrails, skipped the part where you make sure you're not violating a federal funding covenant by firing the one guy holding it together. And Aspen? She didn't even know the clause existed. She thought firing Caleb was just good optics. A bold move. A clean break from the legacy system. What she didn't realize, what no one realized yet, was that Caleb's title wasn't just decorative. It was structural. His role wasn't a desk job. It was a legal anchor point. Removing him without protocol had just triggered a dormant clause buried deep in our Series C funding terms. The Zoom call wrapped with a mix of forced goodbyes and quick disconnects. But within minutes, Slack lit up. Wait, did she actually fire Caleb? Is that even allowed? Legal just said they weren't informed. By noon, someone in finance unearthed an old risk matrix. Caleb's name was still listed. Primary covenant liaison, non-redundant. By 2, a board member requested Article 7.1 from the Series C agreement. By 5, Aspen was still smiling. She was still writing the high bragging on LinkedIn live to some VC about her bold moves and zero hesitation leadership. Like she just revolutionized the industry instead of lighting a fuse under it. Meanwhile, across town, Caleb sat quietly in a coffee shop. A simple place, no noise, no distractions. On the table in front of him was a binder. He flipped to the final page, slid it into place, and pressed it down with calm precision. The title at the top read, "Trigger initiated, awaiting contact." The email wasn't meant for us. Not even close. It was flagged confidential, internal use only, buried under layers of admin routing. But someone in ops messed up. A reply all that shouldn't have happened. That's how legal got it. Subject line, immediate covenant review. Escrow status at risk. The sender? Daniel Harkness, Senior Audit Liaison, Harker and Vale Capital. If that name didn't immediately make your gut twist, you'd clearly never read the Series C agreement cover to cover. By 9:17 a.m. Monday, he was in the building. No heads up. No calendar invite. No visitor badge. Just a crisp navy suit, hard leather briefcase, and a covenant binder thick enough to double as a brick. I watched him walk past my desk with that quiet, terrifying confidence of someone who already knew exactly where the bodies were buried. They called us in one by one to the 8th floor boardroom. CO, interim CFO, Aspen, a few board members, and me, because technically I was the last person Caleb had CC'd before he vanished. The room felt still. Too still. Like basement air right before a tornado hits. Daniel skipped all small talk. He flipped open the binder, turned to page 43, and tapped a highlighted section with the kind of precision that made your skin crawl. "Has Mr. Frost been formally removed?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Per Article 7.1 of the Series C Covenant?" Silence. Aspen blinked once. Then again. "He's no longer with the company," she said, stretching a tight, pure-ready smile across her face. "That decision's already been carried out. HR followed the necessary steps." Daniel looked up, really looked at her for the first time. His expression didn't change. "Then I'll need the board minutes reflecting the 7.1 procedure," he said, "including all signatures. Time-stamped." No one spoke. The audit committee chair, a guy who always looked like retirement was one bad week away, fidgeted with his glasses like they were suddenly too heavy. "I believe the termination was operational. Internal, I mean." Daniel didn't blink. "Just to clarify, you removed a named covenant signatory, with escrow immunity and full compliance access, without triggering board oversight or legal notification." Aspen jumped in fast. "We're streamlining. Modernizing. That position was outdated. He wasn't involved in any current product work." Daniel shook his head once. "He didn't need to be. He was embedded in your escrow key infrastructure. You didn't terminate an employee. You breached a structure." Then he dropped another page onto the table. Caleb's name was printed in bold. 5 times. Under titles like, Non-Revocable Oversight Role, Investor-Facing Escrow Authority, and Clause Activation Fiduciary. I saw Aspen's throat tense as she swallowed. The board started murmuring. Whispers turning sharp, questions about breach clauses, immunity windows, rollback options. Panic bubbling just beneath the surface. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I was too focused on Caleb's signature, sitting there right in the center of the page. Still, the documents had started to speak. Quiet but unmistakable. And they weren't speaking for Aspen. And those documents kept saying the same thing again and again. You don't cut the anchor and expect the ship to stay. We heard the door slam before we saw who it was. Graham Caldwell, the founder, the original CEO, the man whose name was still etched into the company's articles of incorporation, was supposed to be deep into a 6-week wellness sabbatical in Marseille. But here he was, back on day 9, face flushed, tie half loose, with the expression of a man who'd just been woken up by a financial bomb going off under his mattress. I don't think he even stopped at home. Looked like he came straight from the airport. His assistant jogged behind him, iPad in one hand, Aspen's missed calls blinking on the screen. His voice thundered down the hallway. "You dismissed who?" Every head turned. No one breathed. Inside the boardroom, Aspen stood perfectly still, lips pulled into a composed smile that didn't quite make it to her eyes. "It was a strategic restructuring," she said, hands folded neatly like she was leading a PowerPoint, not standing in a corporate minefield. Caleb's role had become Graham shut her down with a single sentence. His role was embedded in the Series C filings, Aspen. Embedded. She tried again, firmer now. I reviewed the operational chain. He hadn't submitted a single product alignment report in over a year. Because he wasn't product, Graham snapped. He was compliance infrastructure. The one who negotiated our escrow carve-outs. The one who designed the immunity triggers. You didn't just fire an employee. You deleted a clause. The board looked like they'd been hit with a live wire. The chair scrambled to open the covenant packet left behind by Harker and Vale, hands fumbling through the tab sections until he found the page with the real damage. There it was. Plain as day. Caleb Frost. Listed 5 times. Clause 6.4A named escrow fiduciary, non-transferable. Clause 7.1. Removal only permissible via full board resolution and investor notification. Clause 9.3. See immediate penalty of $40 million or full forfeiture of escrow rights if breach occurs. Clause 10.2. Audit trigger if any named party removed without written board and legal countersignatures. Clause 14. Investor right of claim on proprietary systems under reversion doctrine if fiduciary clause is breached. Aspen's face drained of color. HR was supposed to. Graham cut in again, his tone flat as ice. HR doesn't execute board resolutions. You signed the removal. You announced it on a public call. There's a recording, Aspen. I didn't know he was tied. That's the problem, isn't it? The room shifted. You could feel it. People who had sat shoulder to shoulder with Aspen for months now subtly angled their chairs away. VPs who had championed her agile realignment suddenly couldn't remember what they'd supported. Her chief of staff stood up halfway through Graham's second sentence and walked out pretending to take a call that wasn't real. A board member leaned forward. Are we on the hook for the $40 million? Daniel Harkness, still seated at the far end of the table, answered without even glancing up. Unless the removal is reversed and fiduciary compliance restored within 72 hours, yes. Otherwise, the escrow structure collapses. Aspen reached for something, anything. Tried to suggest they could reinstate Caleb temporarily, spin it for optics. Graham didn't even let her finish. You think this is about optics? He snapped. You handed a loaded gun to the investor's auditor and said, pull the trigger if you want. Dead silence. Outside the boardroom, the office buzzed with fake distractions. AirPods in ears with no music playing. Fingers typing on keyboards that weren't connected to anything. Slack channels lit up with screenshots, half-whispers and wild guesses. Everyone was listening. And everyone knew. The fallout had only just begun. But inside that boardroom, reality hit like a safe dropped from 5 stories up. Aspen wasn't the CEO anymore. She was just a liability with a title and a ticking clock. The first time I realized Caleb wasn't just the compliance guy was 4 years ago. We were having lunch with outside counsel during our Series B round. One of the lawyers, a sharp, no-nonsense Boston type who probably charged more per hour than most of us made in a week, leaned over his steak salad and said, "That Frost guy? He speaks funding like it's his first language. You don't fire someone like that. You carve him into the damn paperwork." I laughed back then, thought he was just being dramatic. He wasn't. At the time, Caleb worked out of the forgotten corner office, the one nobody wanted. The view was nothing but HVAC pipes, and the ceiling light buzzed every time it rained. He kept walls of binders, real paper with every covenant, every term sheet, every bizarre exception clause ever signed. People used to joke that he was allergic to the cloud. But here's what no one realized, especially not Aspen. Caleb wasn't just maintaining the house. He was building something permanent. One clause at a time. Something living. He embedded himself into the documents like a watermark. Quiet, invisible, and impossible to erase. He'd co-authored the original Series C framework with the lead investor's legal team. He wrote the triggers for joint IP rights, defined the terms of forfeiture so precisely that our escrow protections were basically bulletproof. Caleb didn't just support the foundation. He was the foundation. And Aspen, rushing to repaint the walls, had yanked out the load-bearing beam because it didn't match her aesthetic. Now we were standing in the rubble. Daniel Harkness gathered the board and exec team in the upstairs glass conference room. Lights off. Blinds down. One projector humming. And on the table, a single sheet of paper centered like evidence. Caleb's name highlighted 5 times. Same covenant document. But now it read like a threat. Daniel spoke plainly. You have 2 options, he said. Pay the $40 million breach penalty within 48 hours, or surrender access to all proprietary integrations, including client-side data sync, under Section 14.2. One of the tech co-founders actually choked on his coffee. Aspen stayed silent, frozen in her seat, staring at that sheet of paper like it was about to bite her. Graham leaned in, trying to find some daylight. There has to be a way out. A reversal clause? He's only been gone a few days. Daniel nodded once. There is a reversion window, but it requires the written consent of the removed party. Caleb would have to sign back on, at least temporarily. Every eye in the room shifted to Aspen. She didn't move, didn't lift her head, because she already knew. Caleb wasn't coming back. Not after the Zoom call. Not after she dressed him down in front of leadership like he was a failed intern. Not after saying on the record, "Your value has been recalculated." At 0. She hadn't just terminated him. She'd publicly humiliated him, and smiled while doing it. Outside, rain began to tap lightly against the windows, soft, steady, like the world itself was holding its breath. A junior lawyer whispered, "Do we even know where he is?" Graham let out a breath through his nose. "I know." Back in Caleb's old office, still empty, still facing that damn HVAC unit, a small folder lay neatly in the center of the desk. No lock, no password, just one sheet of paper and a handwritten note in Caleb's sharp, deliberate script. "If you're reading this, the breach has occurred." Clipped beneath it was a printout of a clause no one had ever noticed. It lived quietly inside a dormant section of the architecture license agreement, something about data reversion rights. At the bottom, Caleb's signature. And beneath that, a checkbox. Do not reinstate. It was checked. The ink bled straight through the page. That checkbox, do not reinstate, was pressed so hard, it left a dent in the desk beneath it. Aspen's hands twitched, fingers curling ever so slightly. And for the first time since she'd claimed the CEO chair, her voice cracked. "I didn't know it would trigger this." Daniel didn't blink. "That's the point of embedding safeguards," he said. "They don't care whether you read them." Cold. Final. Caleb hadn't left behind exits. He'd planted landmines. They didn't even try to call it a firing. Pending internal review. That was the phrase legal approved, wrapped in enough corporate padding to make a freefall sound gentle. Aspen didn't argue, didn't object, didn't reach for spin. When the board chair read the motion aloud, she stayed stone still, but her knuckles turned paper white where they gripped the arms of her chair. They told her she was on administrative leave, while they investigated compliance violations related to fiduciary protocol. She gave a single nod. No speech. No PR statement. She stood, adjusted her blazer like it still carried weight, and walked out the door. And just like that, it was over. The golden girl with the LinkedIn slogans and zero time for due diligence. Gone before the first quarter even wrapped. The board didn't hesitate. Within an hour, they were behind closed doors. Founding members. Graham. 2 investor reps. Harker and Vale's top counsel. No assistants. No phones. No leaks. 3 hours passed in silence. When the door opened again, not a word was said, but the room felt different. The silence wasn't uneasy anymore. It was sharp. Surgical. By morning, the board had made it official. Clause 14 reversion was underway. The investor was moving to pull access to all escrowed systems unless the breach could be reversed fast. So they made the only move left. A quiet message routed through unofficial channels. A respectful ask with no pressure, no ego. Would Caleb consider coming back? Not as an employee. Not as head of risk. Just long enough to sign a reversal resolution, to stop the covenant collapse. No one actually expected a yes. But it was the only card they had left. They sent it around 11:45 a.m. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a courier arrived at the front desk. He carried a plain manila envelope. No logo. No seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting. No signature. Just updated contact details, neatly typed under the header. For all future communications involving Frost Holdings LLC. At the bottom, in Caleb's handwriting, "You removed me. I accept." That was it. No drama. No counteroffer. No emotion. Just facts. Graham read the page in silence, folded it carefully, like he was closing the final chapter of a book he never wanted to finish. A board member broke the stillness. "So is that a hard no?" Daniel Harkness answered without looking up. "That's a man who's already gone," he said. "He didn't just leave the building. He left orbit." Someone muttered, trying to joke. "Well, at least he left a forwarding address." No one laughed. Later that evening, a junior IT staffer noticed something strange. The system Caleb had built to monitor investor triggers, the one that had quietly protected the company for years, had shut itself down. Archived everything. Every clause, every amendment, every alert, sealed into a read-only vault titled, "Final Compliance Complete." At the bottom, a timestamp. The vault had locked itself exactly 4 minutes after Caleb's contact note was delivered. He hadn't just declined. He sealed the exit, bolted it from the outside, and left the key under the rug, knowing no one would know where to look. He didn't burn the bridge. He powered it down. Not to punish, just to finish. In the conference room, no one said a word. The HVAC kicked on loud, sudden. A sound so normal, so ordinary it felt like thunder. 11 people sat around that long walnut table. Only one moved. Daniel Harkness. Same sharp navy suit. Same silver Montblanc pen. Same calm, clinical presence. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase, pulled out one final folder, and placed it gently on the glass tabletop. He didn't flip through it, didn't clear his throat or ask for attention. He just opened it to a single page and slid it forward, slow and steady, until the top line was readable by everyone seated. Non-removable risk liaison. Caleb Frost under Article 6.4(b) of the Series C funding covenant. The line was neatly underlined in blue ink. Beneath it, 5 bullet points outlined the legal authority of Caleb's position, specifically his control over escrow triggers, proprietary data systems, and joint client IP frameworks. His name was everywhere. Typed, initialed, signed, still binding, still alive inside the walls of the company. Daniel folded his hands on the table and looked straight at the board chair. "So," he said, voice steady low, "do you have the 40 million on hand? Or should we just take the keys?" Nobody answered. Not Graham. His jaw clenched, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what was no longer salvageable. Not the CFO, who sat staring into space, probably doing silent math on how long the company could survive without escrow access or client-side data sync. Not the VPs, who now realized far too late that the systems they thought they ran had already slipped beneath their feet. And certainly not Aspen. She sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, gaze locked on a spot on the floor, as if staring hard enough might erase her from the moment. That razor-sharp blazer she'd always worn like armor now just looked stiff, out of place, like a costume from a show that had already closed. There were no speeches left. No carefully crafted sound bites. No strategy decks. Just the frozen reality that she'd pulled a pin she thought was a paperclip, and now there was shrapnel everywhere. There would be no last-minute rescue. No emergency override. No sudden return of the man she'd dismissed like he was dead weight. Because Caleb Frost didn't need to sit in that room. He was the room. He was in the contracts, the subclauses, the audit trails. In the compliance nodes, the investor protocols, the systems built to protect everything they took for granted. He'd written himself into the company's bones so subtly, so thoroughly, that the only way to cut him out was to tear the structure down. And they had. By 3 p.m., Harker and Vale had begun the forfeiture paperwork under Clause 14 reversion, transferring full investor control. By 4 o'clock, Caleb's forwarding address, Frost Holdings LLC, was officially registered as the fiduciary contact point for all legacy compliance matters. The building didn't catch fire. It just changed hands. Quietly. Irrevocably. When Aspen finally stood, she said nothing. No dramatic exit. Her badge had already been deactivated. She walked out slower than she ever walked in. And I glanced one last time at the open binder on the table. His signature was there. Clean. Centered. Undeniable. Below the final line, written in Caleb's unmistakable block handwriting, were 6 simple words. Some values aren't recalculated, they're enforced.